Welcome. I will be very, very brief because we have two great guests today. Dilar Dirik, who is a feminist activist but also social scientist, born in Kurdistan, now doing her PhD at Cambridge University in the UK. And Beata Kowalska, a sociologist from Jagiellonian University, who is also a scholar on the Middle East and feminist issues. So the plan for today is Dilar is going to have her talk that's going to last 45 minutes, maybe an hour. Later, Beata will join her for a conversation, and also you are very welcome and encouraged to ask your questions, share your comments, etc. Dilar, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. In Kurdish, we say dembash. It's very happy for me. I'm very happy to be here. It's my first time in Poland, and I'm amazed to see so many people interested in the resistance struggles in Kurdistan. And so first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Jan, Beata, Magda, and everybody else who was involved. I'm not sure how many of you, let me begin with this. Before 5 years ago, how many of you, before the war against the so-called Islamic State, had heard about the Kurdish people? Raise of hands. Oh, wow, okay. Right. Well, okay, so sometimes you shouldn't assume too much about the audience. Well, the reason why I say this is not because I don't think that you are not informed. It's just because I grew up in Europe, and for us it was always the case. We had to explain that we exist. So a lot of people, let's say, on this more general level, they may have heard about the Kurdish question. They know that the Kurdish people are an oppressed people, but they are not very well informed about the specifics of the region, the different resistance struggles, the different ideas of freedom in the region. Of course, the situation in the Middle East is very complicated in general, and now there is a very intense war in the region, which again further confuses the already existing confusing history. And the media does not really play a very enlightening role. And also, of course, we know that history has been written from a specific perspective, which is why very often, due to the fact that we were not able to write our own history, it's the case that today, for the first time, the Kurdish people are actually writing history on their own terms. And I would like to also discuss a little bit what that means for not only for social sciences, but also for political prospects for people everywhere in the world beyond Kurdistan. So I must begin right now. It's impossible to speak about what's happening in Kurdistan without making clear that it's a complete war zone in which people are trying to come up with different ideas of or philosophies of freedom. Right now, today is exactly 1 month that the Turkish army has invaded Afrin, which is a majority Kurdish region in Syria, in the northwest part of Syria. This is a violation of international law. Not only that, actual war crimes are being committed by the Turkish army and jihadist forces that are allied with the Turkish army, which claim to be part of the FSA, but it's a very specific section that has been recruited by the Turkish army. And the language with which the people are attacking the Kurdish region there, which, by the way, are the native people of that land, is a language of genocide. So Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, claims that they want to remove the Syrian-Turkish border from terrorists, and by that he means the local Kurdish population whose homeland this place is. So this is what is happening at the moment, and why this is significant. Of course it's significant, and everybody should care about the life of civilians, the life of refugees. By the way, hundreds of thousands of people have fled to Afrin from other parts of Syria, from places like Idlib, from Manbij, and other places, Aleppo. And civilian targets are deliberately targeted by the Turkish army. and its allies. But beyond that, actually what we can see, this is a specific attack on an emancipatory project at the same time. So it's not only an attack against the Kurdish people as a group that is considered to be hostile by the nationalistic regime of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, but at the same time it's an attack against a different alternative for the Middle East. As many of you know, the region of Kurdistan, it has been divided into four, and the nation-state borders that currently determine the places where we live in the region are colonial borders. So first of all, this is very important when we understand the Western complicity in the conflicts in the region. The Sykes-Picot Agreement 101 years ago, 2 years ago, was basically an agreement between British and French diplomats, Sykes and Picot, which are basically two European names. And they have drawn these borders and artificially decided to divide up the region according to their own interests and profits. And the same borders are still determining the fate of the people there. So when we talk about alternative projects that go beyond the nation-state system for the Middle East, we have to recognize that the nation-state system is very new to the region anyway. In many places, on many occasions, the nation-state system, with its economy, with its way of organizing society, with its psychology, mentality, has not actually penetrated the social fabric of that region. A lot of people, especially Kurdish people, who are more loyal to a tribe, to a village, to a region, to a mountain, have no sense of loyalty to the nation state. Especially, of course, because these four nation states, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, have historically oppressed the Kurdish people to various degrees. Especially in Turkey, there was a policy of active either assimilation or ethnic cleansing. And this is something that the Turkish state first did, of course, with other groups such as the Armenians and the Greeks, and different Christian groups in general. And in the Kurdish case, they wanted to wipe out the existence of the Kurdish people from history maps, from geographical maps, from books, and so on. In Iraq, for example, Saddam Hussein, as many of you know, in the 1980s, he committed a genocide against the Kurdish people by using chemical weapons against them. And same, I mean, not in the same vast violent dimension, but to different degrees also in Iran and in Syria. The Kurdish people have been oppressed, tortured, killed for any kind of political activity. So, of course, in many cases, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, there were Kurdish projects coming usually from this urban, more intellectual kind of circles, more bureaucratic circles, to also demand a nation state, just like other post-colonial contexts. Because the idea was, well, in order to be free, in order to be modern, in order to qualify as a nation, you have to have determined state borders, you have to have your own economy, you have to have your own bureaucracy, and everything that is implied when you want a state. And this was at a time when a lot of people, a lot of different nations, a lot of different groups in formerly colonized places were demanding their own state. Now, in retrospect, we can see that many of these post-colonial projects were led by genuine revolutions, by people who were demanding dignity and freedom from colonial brutality. But because local elites were this time recruited into state formation, they continued their ties with the former colonizers. And what happens is that today we still see the legacy of colonialism in many places, specifically in Africa, in the Middle East, and in different parts of Asia and also Latin America. So in the Kurdish case, like I said, the fact that the Kurdish people have been divided into 4 different countries, this led to them being not only aware of the policies of different places, not only being influenced culturally by different ideologies, different political movements, and so on. It also basically built the foundations to having a more decentralized understanding of how self-determination could look like. And also, as I said in the beginning, The nation-state idea, which is based on like centralism of administration of the economy, of violence and so on, is something very new for the people in the region anyway. The state is not something that the people had as something on their mind constantly. So in that sense, a more decentralized idea of what freedom could look like developed in this sense. The Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which is a guerrilla organization which was formed in 1978 as a political party movement first, a socialist party, and later on in 1984 started armed guerrilla warfare against the Turkish state, was the Kurdish movement which had the most popular, let's say, class base. It was, from the beginning, it recruited not only Kurdish people, but also some of the co-founders were Turkish people. From the beginning, women were a part of it, but not to the same degree as today. This was also a development on its own, which I will come to. And so this was a very interesting split from, let's say, former conceptions of what Kurdish politics could look like, which was, let's say, more urban, intellectual, more like, or rather conservative, feudal land elites which were collaborating with the state. So the Kurdistan Workers' Party, as the name implies, was recruiting workers, the students, the young people, the peasants and women. And before the coup in Turkey in 1980, the leadership of the PKK moved to Syria because they did not want to follow other people and have their headquarters, let's say, in Europe outside of the Middle East, but they went to the only place that provided them some kind of opportunity to do politics. So they went to Syria, which at the time also hosted the Palestinian Liberation Movement and other national liberation movements and revolutionary struggles. In Lebanon, the Kurdish movement learned guerrilla warfare from the PLO, and later on it developed its own strategies. So since the 80s then, and also in the 90s, there was an active struggle against the Turkish state, which was a guerrilla struggle, and it was at that time still not so different from many other Marxist-Leninist movements. The aim was to establish a socialist Kurdistan, a free Kurdistan, a Kurdistan where everybody would be free, but the vision was rather abstract. It was not very clear what is meant by that. And the danger would have been at the time, had they received such a state, it would have been exactly that, received, right, granted from some higher power. And also we have to understand that this was during the time of the Cold War, when anti-colonial movements were positioning themselves according to the policies of the Soviet Union. So, without getting more into the confusing history, coming to where we are today, in 2005, the Kurdish freedom struggle announced a paradigm shift to its former idea of creating an independent socialist Kurdistan. And what is meant by that are several things, because not only did they have the benefit of seeing the different developments in the different parts of Kurdistan, specifically the 2003 American invasion of Iraq, where since 2003 in Iraqi Kurdistan we see something like a de facto state, and we also see that it's actually not very democratic, that it's rather corrupt, that it does not really bring genuine freedom to the people for which they had fought for. It is the accumulation of capital, of security, of bureaucracy and organization in the hand of literally two families, the Barzani and the Talabani family. And this is not why the people fought against Saddam Hussein. This is not why people went up to the mountains and defended their homes. So this corruption of Iraqi Kurdistan was not a result of the people's corrupt character or anything like that. It was a result of a freedom concept, of a liberation or independence concept, which was actually the very opposite of independence. Because it was completely dependent on regional as well as outside forces, it was completely surrendering its economy to others and just becoming a petrostate, basically. So this is one experience that we've had in the last decade and a half of what a Kurdish state would look like if it would exist. So this is one thing, as well as the more philosophical paradigm shift that happened within the PKK in favor of an alternative to the state. So Abdullaha Öcalana, who has been imprisoned on İmralı Island, which is a prison island in Turkey, and just a few days ago it was the anniversary of the international conspiracy against him, the 19th anniversary. So he's been in jail since 99. And so although in the 90s already he had come up with, the party had already decided that they no longer want to struggle for a state, because it increasingly seems very impossible, or let's say not the right solution for the social issues that people have. Instead, to find more confederal solutions, also within a framework of solidarity of all the peoples in that region. So not that the PKK was nationalist from the beginning. Actually, from the beginning, from the 70s onwards, they were always stressing, and this is something you can read in the biographies of the first members or in all the declarations that they have issued, is that this was from the beginning, yes, a national liberation movement, but an anti-national movement, anti-nationalist movement, based on fighting against social chauvinism, against hostility towards communities, but looking at the state as the enemy, not the community, not the people, not the Turkish people are the enemy, but the Turkish state. Also the enemy of the Turkish people is the Turkish state. So, but yes, so although this was the case, like some of these ideas were there from the beginning, especially the liberation of women, which in the 90s or already, like in the early 90s, I mean, from the beginning there were women among the guerrillas, but in the 90s the women formed their own autonomous army, and later on they formed their own autonomous party. And so since then they have their autonomous decision-making mechanisms, but since 2005, this idea of democratic confederalism, which from now on I will focus on that, has given people more the means to organize on a wider, more popular scale, and to basically not rely on the guerrillas or on the party to do something on their behalf, but to actually promote people's direct self-governance on this face-to-face level. And this is what we will discuss today about what is happening in Rojava, in the Syrian part of Kurdistan. So in 2005, as I've said, with the experience of Iraqi Kurdistan as a de facto state, with the collapse of the Cold War blocs, with the failure of many national liberation movements, with the increase of neoliberalism, it was a time of chaos really in Kurdistan. Also in 2003, within the PKK, there was a massive internal break where a lot of people seeing or being encouraged by the system of Iraqi Kurdistan said, actually, why do we struggle for socialism? What is this revolution like? We didn't receive anything. Look, the way to go seems to be capitalism. So there was a huge break that happened in that time as well. So in this period, of course, Öcalan is in prison. And although I said many of the ideas that he had were existent in the beginning, and also there were outcomes of different discussions within the movement, in 2005 he articulated democratic confederalism as an alternative to the nation state, which basically completely turned upside down the same assumptions that the same movement with the same people had in the beginning in 78 when it was formed. So what is democratic confederalism? It is the system, the political, economic, social system on which the revolution in Rojava is trying to organize itself. Basically, the assumption is several things. It's very difficult to explain this because it's above all, it's a lived experience. It's a practice that people are still experimenting with. So whatever I am going to say from now on, it's not something that is set in stone. It is something that people are constantly redeveloping and rediscovering. So in the former analysis of the same movement, the problem was the statelessness of the Kurds. Why do we have problems? Why are we subject to genocide, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, exploitation? Because we don't have a state. So with this new paradigm, the conclusion was actually, it's not statelessness that is the problem, the state is the problem. So everything that happened to the Kurdish people, because they're Kurdish people, happened because they are basically, they don't have a status within this nation-state system. But actually, it's not because the state is so great and they just happen to be excluded from it. It's because the very idea, the logic, the economy, the structure and the mechanisms of the state, they are the problem. Because they're based on hierarchy, because they're based on domination, on authoritarianism, on the exploitation of the people, not only economically, but also mentally and culturally. And the ones who suffer most from it are not only oppressed ethnic, religious, cultural minorities, but also precisely women and the young people. So, in his writings from prison, especially in the 5 volumes that are considered to be his defense writings. So basically, Öcalan writes from prison, but he doesn't write. Of course, the Turkish state is not going to just publish his books. These writings are actually his defense writings to the European Court of Human Rights, and then the lawyers take them and turn them into books. So, when you look at history, when you look at ancient history, actually Mesopotamia, which is basically the land between 2 rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris River, this basically overlaps somehow with Kurdistan, what we call Kurdistan today. So in Kurdistan, you can see some of the oldest settlement sites of ancient civilizations. You find the oldest churches, among the oldest churches. You find very ancient cultures. You find mountains that really, where history was taking place, and still a lot of archaeological sites which have not been uncovered. Göbekli Tepe, for example, which basically shifted history back by, I don't know, by far, is also in Kurdistan. It's actually very close to the birthplace of Abdullaha Öcalan. So when you look at the history of the Middle East, of ancient Mesopotamia, 5,000 years ago, with the emergence of the state, you see that actually the history of the state is in fact the history of hierarchy and domination. It is the time where actually also the first word, the first recorded word for the word writing, for the word freedom, amargi, is coming up. So amargi is the first word known in history for the concept of freedom. And interestingly, if you don't struggle for freedom, you also wouldn't have a word for it. So this must also be a time when people first felt their unfreedom. And also it means, by the way, return to the mother. So you see, this was a time when administration was centralized in the city-states. You see that women, when you analyze the mythology and the historical records of the time, you see a massive fall in the status of women. And you also see that basically the first armies, the first temples, the first basically monopolies on culture, on writing, on history making, on money, on debt, and so on. So this is considered by historians, the emergence of the state is considered to be a huge break in history, a rupture in favor of authority and in favor of hierarchy and domination. This does not mean that people before they lived in this, matriarchal state of nature and everything was peaceful. People still have their conflicts, but this is the first time when mechanisms of monopolism and hierarchy, authority were institutionalized, where they were set in stone and set in law. So in his writings, Öcalan looks specifically about what this period has meant for women. And interestingly enough, in this case, he's very unique as a leader of a national liberation movement. The emphasis that you can only measure your freedom struggle if it really puts women at the forefront and also makes them the agents that get to decide the terms on which this freedom is going to be based on. So analyzing the links between the state, patriarchy, and capitalism or any form of economic monopolism has then led to this idea of democratic confederalism, which is based on a paradigm of radical democracy, ecology, and women's liberation. So this is the basic assumption, and the practice is in the form of democratic autonomy. So what does democratic autonomy mean? It is basically figuring out ways to economically, socially, culturally, politically organize your own community on a local, face-to-face level without reliance on the state. So first, this idea was started in Turkey when people started to form their economic cooperatives, their agricultural cooperatives, where they were forming their assemblies in their villages, in their towns, where they were trying to find ways of organizing their everyday lives without the state. When they were coming up with education systems, academy systems that were not repeating the lies and the constructions of history of the state, but where they were coming up with their own ways of social science and so on. So, of course, in 2009, the Turkish state cracked down upon these structures, and around 10,000 people were arrested in 2009 on charges of terrorism. And who were these people? They were activists. Some of them were lawyers, teachers, young people, women activists. So basically people from the popular levels of the community who were just trying to find ways of autonomous self-organization. And they were charged as terrorists, and many of them are still in prison, although almost 10 years have passed. In 2012, many of you know that in 2011 the war in Syria began, and it was within the context that was called Arab Spring, which was a period where many people went on the streets to demand justice, to demand freedom, to demand a life in dignity. People said no to the authoritarian, fascist governments that they had to confront, and they wanted a different life. And we see, unfortunately, that this war is still dragging on, but it's not because of the demands of the people. They were completely justified, but unfortunately, different international and regional powers benefited from the situation and have torn an entire country apart. In 2012, as I said, the Kurdish people in the north of Syria have started their autonomous self-governance structures. When the regime forces withdrew and went to other parts of the country, especially because there were other clashes with the rebel groups in other parts, the Kurdish areas were not prioritized. However, due to their experience, with their long experience with, decades-long experience with autonomous self-organization underground, due to the PKK's presence in the region, and I should say here that Öcalan and the guerrillas who were organizing themselves there to fight against the Turkish state, they had massive assemblies with people, they had educated, organized people, so there was already a culture since the 80s of people ordinary working class people, peasants, people from the rural areas organizing themselves, and especially women. I have interviewed many women of an older generation who say the revolution in Rojava, the women's revolution in Rojava, did not start in 2012. It started in 1979 when Abdullaha Öcalana and his comrades came here, because that was the first time that women left their homes. This was the first time when women met other people outside of their families and where they became agents of political public life. Although, of course, due to the suppression by the regime, this was all done secretly and underground, but this was happening. So in 2012, already the people seized the infrastructure, the former government buildings, and they started with their own self-governance structures. So, and how are these organized? in the beginning, in each town, in each region, they established these people's councils, or some people call them assemblies, but we say something like councils. And later on, the more they developed, the more they started working, they organized themselves in the form of communes. So you have now communes and councils as the political, direct democratic structures there. But also you have a parallel system, which is a more representative one. And I will come to the potential clashes between the two systems in a little bit. Okay. I asked him to give me a sign after a while, so I know how I am with time. And so today in Rojava, imagine all of us would live in the same neighborhood. Imagine we live in this neighborhood, and basically we would form a commune, and we would decide to organize our own lives by ourselves. What does that mean? We get to decide whether how we should garden this area. We would organize our own economy. We would organize our safety, because you have to imagine this is a war zone there, so people really need to think about security and safety. The women in this room would organize themselves autonomously also in the form of a women's commune, and we would decide on the issues that specifically concern women. So the idea of women's autonomy is based on, of course, the idea that women should be the pioneers, the guarantees for this democratic system. But also it's because under capitalism specifically, but generally under patriarchal feudal structures, women are really discouraged from speaking out. They don't believe in their own strength. So, and in fact, especially under neoliberalism, they're encouraged to compete with each other. They're encouraged to criticize each other, to work for the male gaze. So these autonomous women's spheres are places where women experience a sense of sisterhood or solidarity with people in their own situation, to be strong in the general structures. So, so we would organize committees for education, for health, for services, for security and things like that. And these would rotate. So this is how things are working right now in Rojava. But of course, you have to imagine there's also hundreds of thousands of refugees, internally displaced people from other parts. So they also need to be somehow integrated into the system. In the newly liberated areas, people first formed councils and then encouraged the people to be part in terms of communes. This region that we're talking about is extremely diverse, so you don't have just Kurdish people living there. Arab people, Turkmen people, Chechen people, Armenians, Syriacs, Assyrians, Chaldeans. So you have different religions and different Yazidis, Muslims, Christians. So it's my point is it's very, very diverse. Yeah. So we are talking about a very, very ancient place where for millennia people have lived together, and somehow they managed. But right now, this region is called Syrian Arab Republic. So this idea of this chauvinistic nationalism is really an import from the former colonizers. And so this idea of democratic nation, also proposed by Öcalan, is basically also a new way of thinking of ourselves as a collective. So rather than perpetuating the notion of ethnic nations, or really turning inward towards your own religious or ethnic community, it's to think about a nation that is unified with the diversity of its components. So it would be a nation based on ideals, on ethics rather than on ethnicity. So in that sense, the different groups are encouraged to participate in the system with their own identity in order to guarantee the democracy of it. But at the same time, they are discouraged from, turning inward and just clinging on to this ethnic identity, because that is precisely the reason why there are so many conflicts. So this is that. We can get into the details of how this works, because I think we're kind of running out of time. But basically, what this means for the region, which is driven by nationalism, by religious fundamentalism, by fake secularisms, by basically different forms of fascism, especially violence against women, patriarchal fascism. We have seen the peak of that with the attacks of ISIS on the different communities in the region. The very fact that ISIS, in August 2014, when the Yazidi community was attacked, for example, or also other communities, but specifically there, that was like the most brutal instance. They deliberately targeted women. They used sexual violence, gang rape, sex slavery. They cut the heads of people. They threw gay people from roofs and things like that. So it really does not come from a religious interpretation. It's pure fascism, and it's actually very, very similar to different forms of fascism. This hatred towards those who are outside of this concept of power based on hierarchy and domination. So the idea of democratic confederalism as a way of giving power back to the people by letting people who never had an education, who never had anything to say in how life should work, who really, women didn't even get to decide what should happen in their own houses because they were so restricted by their own husbands or family members. Today, these people, they get to run their own society. For today, these people, exactly in this format, they sit together, they come together several times to discuss very basic things. And what it does is really, it gives people back the sense of, I am part of history, I am here, I exist, I was not erased from history, I was not erased from the universe, I make change, my work, my labor, my creativity, my initiative is actually producing something valuable, and it brings out my own initiative as a person. This especially applies for women. And as many of you have seen, the women have fought against ISIS, and unfortunately the media only focused on that element. They often looked away when the women were talking about their motivations, which is nothing less than revolutionary. They say, we don't want gender equality, we want to smash patriarchy, we want to get rid of the mentality of ISIS within our own brains. We want to change and democratize the family. We want to try to see how we can live life differently. And therefore, it's all actually a matter of self-defense. In our philosophy, in the philosophy of the Kurdish women's movement, or in the Kurdish freedom movement in general, self-defense, understood as an ecological, let's look at it from an ecological perspective, what Öcalan calls the rose theory. So every rose has a thorns to defend itself, just like every natural organism has a way of defending itself to exist, not to destroy another living being, but to exist and to assert their existence. So in our understanding of self-defense, of course the women and men had to defend their homes against attacks of people who wanted to loot and destroy their homes. So there is of course a physical element to this, but at the same time, self-defense means to assert and mobilize and organize and express your political will. It means to establish an understanding of education, an understanding of social science, for example, that does not repeat the same mechanisms that have led to colonialism, racism, sexism, and so on. It means also to organize an economy based on sustainability and subsistence and harmony with nature, and not on the domination and looting of nature. Because you are part of that nature, so therefore, in order to exist, you have to basically find ways of becoming part of that ecology. A lot of our issues are due to industrialism and a very wrong understanding of progress that has meant nothing but genocide on nature and peoples and indigenous communities. So in that sense, self-defense means to be able to express your identity through creativity, through productivity, through solidarity. And therefore, this model that is being encouraged, that is being built up in spite of its obstacles and mistakes and shortcomings, because after all, we're talking about this for millions of people who are literally trapped in a war zone. So there's economic embargoes, there's traumas, there's apolitical mindsets. So in this environment, people are trying to do this kind of revolution. like even the political consciousness, like people don't see the need to become politically active because whenever they have been, they were completely massacred by dictatorships. So promoting, bringing out that political consciousness, this was the reason why Kobane in 2014 became the bastion of resistance against fascism. Because of that, Kobane, I'm sure many of you have heard of Kobane becoming the city that defeated ISIS. This was happening because the people, the young people to the oldest people in that society, they knew this is a fight against fascism and they have to win, that they cannot surrender. This resistance legacy, this way of life is at stake. So the attacks on Afrin, for example, again, they need to be looked at from this perspective. Just one last thing before I end. A couple of weeks ago, there was a horrible video that was circulated on social media of a woman named Barin Kobani. She was a fighter of the Women's Defense Units of the YPG. And she was on the floor, dead. Her clothes ripped, her breasts cut off, her body burned, so it was, her dead body was tortured. And she was surrounded by a herd of men who are saying disgusting things, who are stepping on her dead body with mutilated breasts. And on social media, in Turkish social media circles, things were said like, female pig, or this is what happens if you put women to the front line. So, I mean, the reason why I'm giving this very descriptive thing is like this is exactly what is at stake. A Middle East, a Mesopotamia, a Kurdistan, a world of a liberated woman who becomes the agent of her own destiny, who becomes the person who gets to decide her own fate, who becomes a valuable, meaningful person that is, she is part of that society, she is it, or a Middle East, a world, a universe where women are condemned to sex slavery, violence, to torture, mutilation, and living for other people, basically, more than an animal would. That is at stake. Also at stake is an understanding of solidarity, of the different communities, where everybody is free to speak their own language, where the most ancient cultures have a revival, where ancient history is recovered, where the universal history of humanity gets discussed and then projects can be built from then on, or an idea of civilization based on violence and power, which accepts only one nation, one state, one language, one flag, and which is basically an ideology of genocide and massacre. So this is why the revolution in Rojava is so significant. It's not the ultimate answer to a capitalist modernity. It is not the ultimate answer to the world solution, but it is a model that is being tried in the midst of chaos and war and destruction by people who are severely traumatized, who have lost so many people and so many loved ones and their homes. And this should, for everyone, should be a sign of hope. Because right now what we're seeing in the world is a crackdown on civil rights, right-wing populism increasing, fascism, racism, extreme violence against women. And we really need something that can keep people going in terms of how to organize life differently. The question of applicability is often asked, and I'm sure this will maybe come up in the discussion in a little bit, but just to say one thing about that, is Rojava's model is not something that can be copy and pasted elsewhere, just as it is, because the very idea of democratic autonomy means that every context is different. The situation in this town is different from a place in the Middle East, just as even in the Middle East, each place is different. The idea is to be aware of the conditions of your own community and find the solutions that work best for you. Find them in a way that is ecological, socially ecological also, not just like in terms of the environment and nature, but also to look at society as a dynamic, organic whole, which has its dynamic on its own. And also to never ever compromise when it comes to the liberation of women, never ever compromise when it comes to protecting those who have been most marginalized and most oppressed, and to make sure that the political spheres that we create really bring out the creativity and initiative of all of its members. And this must be, of course, with the complete commitment to anti-fascism and like a new way of thinking about what fascism and anti-fascism mean today. I think this is one way that we can start in Europe.
So anyway, I know that Beata has a few things to say, and I also look forward to your discussion. Thank you very much.